I'm an artist, engineer, scientist, and designer, and one of the co-inventors of the molten glass 3D printing process. And I make glass. I blow glass, and I love glass. I think I've always really enjoyed making things. And then as an undergrad, alongside the mechanical engineering coursework I was doing, I started blowing glass. And they existed as these sort of like parallel paths for me for a long time. And then professionally, I was doing industrial 3D printing. And when I was back for grad school, I had the opportunity to bring all three of those together. I was in a class on 3D printing, and there was a project piece, and I met some other amazing researchers. And there was sort of a shared interest and curiosity in trying to print glass. And I think what I had been missing was a sort of reason to try. I think I had sort of felt like it was possible for a long time, but wasn't sure why. And finding other people sort of meant that we could just do it for the joy of trying to do it. And later figure out the why. And I think that in some ways has been, interestingly, one of the harder questions of like trying to find a place for it in the world, because it sort of started from just the joy of doing it. Yeah, so our molten glass 3D printing process works by filling a crucible with molten glass. You can also fill it with cullet, but if you start with molten glass, you can sort of move along faster. And then you heat up a nozzle, and molten glass flows down through the nozzle. So it's just coming out at a steady rate. And then it's as simple as sort of tracing out the path that you want it to follow underneath. And so you can either move the nozzle itself, which we did in the first generation of the printer, or move the build plate instead, which we did in the sort of second and third generations of the printer. They have sort of both trade-offs, but as you move the nozzle around, you slowly lower the build plate. And so the more space exists, and then layer by layer, you stack these sort of beads of molten glass and slowly trace out the form of an object. And over the course of 20 minutes to 2 hours, you make an object. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about 3D printing glass is the opportunity to realize designs that haven't been realized before, and the opportunity to get complex objects kind of for free from the manufacturing process, which is something that otherwise, in almost any other way you make something, extra complexity is sort of more expensive to make. And in 3D printing, that's not the case. And I think that also within the glass industry, what we've succeeded at doing is making a lot of glass as uniform and inexpensive as possible. So there's just a world worth of flat, perfect sheet glass. But it's sort of impersonal, and we're further from the manufacturing, and it isn't tailored to what we need necessarily. It's tailored to like what we have. So you see all these methods trying to convert it into other things, to ask new questions. And the printer and printing glass in general gives you this opportunity to rethink how you're making it. And so there needs to be like an intentionality to why you're making it. And then it gives you this opportunity to create totally different forms and to think about what you need specifically for the glass that you want. I think that the different pillars partly also started as different perspectives and different people often. And I think slowly I've absorbed more of these roles within myself and sort of found more opportunity to sort of think in these different ways. But I would say that I loved, when I worked for Mediated Matter and Neri Oxman, the idea of thinking about process and product all at the same time. And that this sort of, the idea that you as the maker of a technology or a machine gave you a sort of special insight into what could be made with it. And therefore this sort of like onus to do something exciting and interesting with it. That was a really powerful starting point. And so I think, found ourselves from the beginning thinking about like the engineering of how do you make this machine? How do you make it work well? The research behind, okay, what are the sort of scientific questions? How does this fit within the community of 3D printers? How does this fit within the glass community? And then from the sort of design perspective, what do you make with this? And how is that novel? How is that pushing things forward? And I think that sort of came together holistically and really unlocked both making the process, but also having something exciting to demonstrate from it and show and motivate the making. And I think that there was a degree of art all along in that, but that became more sort of focused and honed more lately in my own personal practice, and has given me another outlet to just sort of push things weirder and more experimental and try to figure out how can I take something that has sort of previously I'd been thinking about from a product or design space and try to have it express more like personal feelings and thoughts and emotions. And that sort of has unlocked for me the idea of trying to embed imagery and text in the material. And so that's been a pretty compelling additional facet. I think it's a little hard to know what comes next or like what the biggest breakthrough is going to be. I think one of the really important pieces is trying to figure out how to make it like a little bit more affordable, a little bit more robust, and then trying to figure out how to scale the output and connect with industry and get this work out there and into the built environment in a different way. One of the pieces of advice that I would give is that everything can be sort of broken down into little small steps. And I think sometimes when you look at someone else's career or their journey, you see the sort of zoomed out version, and it seems unapproachable that someone else could follow in your footsteps. And I think one of the realizations of glass is that of printing glass is you could break it into all of these little steps. And many of those little steps like weren't that remarkable. And so it's doing something innovative is often just about doing something little and making like one little step forward and then adding those together to get to some big breakthrough. The other piece of advice I think I have about glass is that I think you need to listen to it. I've described it sort of as a loud material. It has a lot of opinions. I think you don't force it into doing what you want. It's a dialogue with it. You have to really listen to what it wants and what you want and find a middle ground, a sort of synergy, a compromise about what the physics and the nature of it is looking for, and then also what you want. I think if you do that in a thoughtful way, you can end up in a sort of really productive relationship with glass and in a really interesting place.